She was 79 years old. She still made her own coffee every morning, still folded her laundry on Tuesday afternoons, still knew every neighbor on her street by name, their dogs, their grandchildren, the color of their front door. And somehow, in the span of 14 months, 3 people who claimed to love her, most managed to convince her that the daughter who had been by her side for 31 years was trying to steal from her. That daughter was me. My name is Rebecca Harmon. I grew up in Marietta, Georgia. And the woman we are talking about, the woman at the center of all of this, is my grandmother, Dorothy Harmon. 81 years old now, still alive, still in the house she has lived in since 1974. But the woman sitting in that house today is not entirely the same woman I knew, and what happened inside those 4 walls, the whispers, the documents, the manipulation that my aunt and my 2 cousins orchestrated with what I can only describe as surgical patience, that is what this story is about. I did not know it was happening. Not at first. You never do. And by the time I understood what they were doing, she had already signed her name 4 times. 4 separate amendments to a will she had written when she was clear-headed, sharp, and completely aware of what she wanted. But here is what my aunt did not account for. Grandma Dorothy had a psychiatrist, and that psychiatrist had been keeping very careful notes. Every single change to that will, every dollar rerouted, every property reassigned, every line rewritten to push me out and pull them in, was made during a documented window of cognitive decline. And when that report landed in front of a probate judge in Cobb County, Georgia, the entire thing unraveled. But I am getting ahead of myself. Because before you understand the ending, you need to understand the beginning. You need to understand who Dorothy Harmon is, who raised her, who she chose to trust, and why that trust cost all of us more than any of us were prepared to pay. Tone? Warm. Specific. Nostalgic, but grounded. Build audience investment in Dorothy and Rebecca. My grandmother was born Dorothy Mae Collins in 1944 in a small house outside of Cartersville, Georgia. 3rd of 6 children. Her father worked at the textile plant. Her mother took in ironing. She was the kind of woman who measured love in actions, not words. She did not say I love you the way people do now, casually, at the end of every phone call. She said it by showing up, by being there when the casserole dish was still hot and the grief was still fresh, by sitting next to you on the porch without saying a single word, because she understood that sometimes silence is the most generous thing another person can offer. She married my grandfather, James Harmon, in 1965. They had 3 children, my father, Robert, my aunt, Linda, and my uncle Thomas, who died in 1998, a loss that changed my grandmother in ways none of us fully appreciated until much later. James passed in 2009, and after that, Dorothy became, I do not know how else to say this, she became mine. Not in a possessive way, not in the way my aunt would later try to frame it. She became mine, the way responsibility finds you when you are the one who shows up. And I showed up. I lived 22 minutes from her house. I was there every Sunday. I took her to her medical appointments. All of them. The cardiologist in Kennesaw. The eye doctor on Roswell Road. The general practitioner she had been seeing since before I was born. I kept a folder. A literal manila folder with every medication she was taking, every dosage, every refill date. I kept it in my glove compartment, so I would never be caught without information if she needed care. I want you to understand something about that folder. I am not telling you about it to make myself sound heroic. I am telling you about it because my aunt, Linda Mercer, would later stand in a courthouse and suggest that my involvement in my grandmother's medical care was a form of control. That I was isolating Dorothy. That I was managing her health care as a way to manage her. That manila folder, that ordinary, coffee-stained, rubber-banded folder, became a piece of evidence. I need you to sit with that for a second. But before we get to the accusations, let me tell you who else was in Dorothy's life during those years, because that is where the story really starts. My Aunt Linda is 5 years younger than my father. She married Gary Mercer in 1991, moved to Alpharetta, and for most of my childhood, she was present the way a person is present when nothing inconvenient is happening. Holidays. Birthdays. The kind of events where showing up costs you nothing and earns you credit anyway. She has 2 children. My cousins, Darren and Kayla Mercer. Darren is 34. Kayla is 31. Both of them live within 15 minutes of their mother. Both of them, I later learned, were carrying significant financial pressure in the years before this story begins. Darren had a landscaping business that had been struggling since 2019. Kayla had gone through a divorce in 2021 and was fighting for shared custody of her daughter while working 2 part-time jobs. I did not know any of that at the time. I knew they existed. I knew Grandma Dorothy loved them. I knew she sent them birthday cards and kept their children's school photos on the refrigerator. I did not know they had been having long private conversations with her. I did not know those conversations had started to include questions about the house, about the savings accounts, about what the will said and who it was leaving things to. I did not know, because nobody told me, and because I was not listening for it. That was my first mistake, and it is the mistake I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count. I should have been listening. I know that now. But when you love someone, and you trust that the people around them love them too, you stop listening for footsteps. You stop checking the doors. And that is exactly when someone walks through one. Delivery. Pause. Reflective, not promotional. Flows from the previous, emotional beat. If you have ever had someone in your family who depended on you, really depended on you, I think you already know the particular exhaustion of being the one who shows up. And I think you might already be feeling something about where this is going. If this kind of story is familiar to you, if it touches something you have seen or lived through yourself, you might want to stay with me for the rest of it. Because I promise you, it gets stranger, and it gets uglier. But it also gets resolved. And the resolution is not what anyone expected. Dorothy turned 78 in March of 2021. We celebrated at her house, the same way we always did. I brought a lemon pound cake from the bakery on Canton Road, because that is what she has always wanted on her birthday. Not chocolate, not anything fancy, just lemon pound cake, with a thin glaze and exactly 3 candles, regardless of how old she is actually turning. She sat at the head of her kitchen table, and she laughed at something my daughter said. And I remember thinking, I remember this clearly. I thought, she is going to outlive all of us. And then, around October of that same year, something shifted. It was subtle. The kind of subtle that you rationalize away the first 5 times you notice it, because you are not ready for what it might mean. She called me by the wrong name. Not my aunt's name. Not my mother's name. She called me Susan, her sister, who has been dead since 2003. She did it once, and then caught herself, and laughed, and said she was just tired. I laughed with her. I filed it away under it was just one time. Then there was the medication. I had set up a weekly pill organizer for her, Monday through Sunday, morning and evening. I would refill it every Sunday when I came by. One afternoon in November, I noticed the Wednesday evening compartment was still full. She had been home all week. She had simply forgotten. Again, I rationalized. Everybody forgets things. She was 78. That is not nothing. I made a note to check more carefully. But then, in December, she told me something that stopped me cold. She told me that Linda had been coming by a lot more often. And she said it the way you say something that you expect to be good news, cheerful, like she was telling me about a pleasant surprise. And I smiled, and I said, "That is so nice, Grandma." And I meant it. I genuinely meant it. What I did not ask, what I should have asked, was, what are they talking about? I brought up the memory issue with her primary care physician in January of 2022. He ran some basic cognitive assessments and referred her to a specialist, a geriatric psychiatrist named Dr. Anita Voss, based out of a practice in Marietta. Dr. Voss began seeing Dorothy in February of 2022. I want you to remember that name, Dr. Anita Voss, because 18 months later, her documented clinical observations would become the most powerful thing in our entire legal case. But in February of 2022, I was not thinking about legal cases. I was thinking about lemon pound cake and Sunday visits, and whether my grandmother was sleeping enough and eating enough, and whether the furnace filter needed to be changed. I was thinking about the next small thing I could do to help her. I was not thinking about what my aunt was planning. The first time I felt something was off, I was standing in my grandmother's kitchen in April of 2022. I had come by on a Sunday, Same as always. I let myself in with the key she had given me years ago. I called out her name. She answered from the back bedroom. And when I walked into the kitchen to start on lunch, I noticed something on the counter. A yellow legal pad. There were notes on it. Not my grandmother's handwriting. Neat, organized printing that I recognized immediately as Kayla's. The notes were, I cannot fully describe what I felt looking at them. They were organized like a list. And some of the line items were things like Bank of America, ask about account access and Johnson property, confirm square footage and attorney referral, estate planning, not Harmon's guy. That last one, not Harmon's guy. I stood there in that kitchen for a long moment. The refrigerator hummed. The neighbor's dog barked twice outside. I could smell the coffee she had made a few hours earlier, still sitting in the pot, gone cold. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself families talk about estate planning. It is responsible. It is practical. I told myself I was being paranoid. I flipped the legal pad over and I went back to making lunch. And I have regretted that decision every single day since. Because that legal pad was not nothing. That legal pad was the outline. The working document. The early draft of something that had been in motion for months before I stumbled across it on a Sunday afternoon in my grandmother's kitchen. Over the next several weeks, I started to notice other things. Small things. The kind of things that individually mean nothing, but when you stack them up, when you lay them side by side, they start to look like a blueprint. Grandma Dorothy mentioned, almost in passing, that Linda had recommended a new attorney. Someone fresh, she said. Someone who could look at everything with new eyes. She said it like it was Linda's idea, for her benefit. I asked, gently, who the attorney was. She could not remember the name. She said Linda had it. I asked if she wanted me to be involved in those conversations, the way I had been involved in her medical appointments. She hesitated, just for a moment. And then she said, Linda thinks it might be better to keep it separate. Keep it separate. Those 3 words are where everything changed for me. Because I knew. I did not have proof. I did not have evidence. I just knew in the way you know something when you have been paying close attention to a person for 3 decades. I knew that Dorothy Harmon had not arrived at that sentence on her own. Someone had handed it to her. And now I needed to figure out what they had handed her, and why, and how long it had been in the works. The summer of 2022 was the summer I started to feel like I was losing my mind. Not dramatically, not all at once. It was more like the way a photograph fades, so gradually that you do not notice the color draining until one day you look at it and realize the faces have gone gray. Dorothy started saying things to me that did not track. Small things. Things that felt just slightly off. Like a picture frame hanging 2 degrees crooked. You see it every day. You adjust to it. And then one afternoon, the light hits it differently. And you realize it has been wrong this entire time. She told me once, in July, that she had not seen me in 3 weeks. I had been there the previous Sunday. I had brought her groceries, sweet tea, the store brand saltines she likes, 2 cans of chicken noodle soup, a pint of vanilla ice cream. I remembered exactly, because I had forgotten the ice cream the week before, and she had mentioned it, and I had made a point of not forgetting again. I did not argue with her. You do not argue with someone whose memory is slipping. You redirect. You reassure. I said, Grandma, I was here last Sunday. Do you remember? We watched the evening news together. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, Linda told me you have been too busy. Linda told me you have been too busy. I want you to understand what that sentence did to me, because on the surface it sounds almost nothing. It sounds like a misunderstanding. It sounds like the kind of thing that gets sorted out over a cup of coffee. But what Linda had actually done, what I understand now with complete clarity, is that she had been planting seeds. Slowly. Consistently. Every visit, every phone call, every casual conversation, she had been watering a version of me that did not exist. A version of Rebecca who was neglectful, distracted, only interested in the inheritance and the tragedy of dementia. The particular cruelty of it is that new information sticks more easily than old truth. Dorothy had decades of evidence that I loved her, but Linda was giving her fresh impressions, week after week, and fresh impressions have a weight that history cannot always match. I started keeping a log in August of 2022. Nothing formal, just a notes app on my phone. Date, time, what I did, how long I stayed, what we talked about. I did not fully know why I was doing it. Some part of me, some quiet, practical part, had started to understand that I might need to prove things later. That instinct may have saved everything. Because, in September of 2022, my grandmother told me something that made the floor drop out from under me. She said, "Linda helped me update some of my papers." I asked what papers. She said, "Just some things. The house, I think, and the accounts." And then, she changed the subject. She asked me if I wanted more sweet tea. She asked about my daughter. She moved on the way she often moved on, not deceptively, but because the conversation had already drifted somewhere else in her mind. I sat at that kitchen table for the rest of the afternoon, drinking tea I could not taste, talking about things I cannot remember, and inside, I was running through every implication of the words, the house, and the accounts. My grandmother owned that house free and clear, paid off in 1998. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths on a half-acre lot in Marietta that had appreciated to somewhere north of $340,000. She also had 2 savings accounts, one at Regions Bank, one at a credit union she had been a member of since the 1970s. Combined, somewhere in the range of $90,000. Money she and James had saved over 50 years of working, of going without, of choosing the store brand, and keeping the thermostat low. And Linda had helped her update some papers. I drove home that night on Highway 41, with my hands so tight on the steering wheel that my knuckles ached. I did not cry. I was too frightened to cry. Tone, outrage, carefully contained. The antagonists reveal their strategy. Rebecca's enabling flaw, her conflict avoidance, costs her precious time. I called my father that night. Robert Harmon is not a confrontational man. He is the kind of man who believes that families work things out, that blood means something, that patience is almost always the right strategy. He is also the man who taught me, by example, to avoid conflict until avoidance becomes its own kind of damage. I told him what Grandma had said. About the papers, about the house and the accounts. I told him about the legal pad I had seen in April, about the attorney Linda had recommended, about the way Dorothy had said Linda thinks it might be better to keep it separate. There was a long pause on the phone. Then my father said, "Rebecca, let us not jump to conclusions." And I said, "Dad, what conclusions are left to jump to?" He said he would call Linda. He said he was sure there was an explanation. He said the family did not need this kind of drama. I want to be honest with you about something. Part of me was relieved when he said that. Part of me wanted him to be right, because the alternative, the thing I was actually starting to believe, was so ugly, so calculated, that accepting it meant accepting that people I had known my whole life were capable of something I did not have a clean word for. So I let him make the call. And 2 days later, he told me Linda had said I was overreacting, that she was just helping Mother get organized, that it was nothing nefarious, and I needed to stop treating every family decision like a personal attack. And then, 3 weeks after that, Linda called me directly. I remember where I was when the phone rang. I was in the parking lot of a Kroger on Whitlock Avenue, sitting in my car with a bag of groceries in the back seat, half of which were for Dorothy. And Linda's name came up on my screen, and I stared at it for 4 full rings before I answered. She was warm, friendly even. She said she was calling because she was worried about me. She said she had noticed that I seemed stressed when it came to Grandma. She said she thought I had taken on too much and it was not fair to me or to Dorothy. She said, "We think it might be healthier for everyone if you took a step back." I asked her who we was. She said the family. She said Darren and Kayla were concerned. She said they had all talked and agreed that I had been wonderful. Just wonderful. But that I needed to let others carry some of the load. I asked her, very carefully, whether this was about the papers Dorothy had mentioned. And her voice shifted. Just slightly. The warmth thinned out like ice in April. She said, "Dorothy's affairs are Dorothy's business. If she has chosen to make adjustments, that is her right." Then she said the thing that I have replayed in my head more times than I can count. She said, "I hope you are not planning to make this difficult, Rebecca, for everyone's sake. Especially mothers. Especially mothers. She used my grandmother's vulnerability as a warning. She gift-wrapped a threat inside a concern and handed it to me like it was a kindness. I sat in that Kroger parking lot for a long time after the call ended. The groceries in the back seat included Dorothy's saltines and her vanilla ice cream and her sweet tea. I had a receipt for $11.42 that proved I had been there, buying things for a woman who was being told by her own daughter that I was the problem. I took a photograph of that receipt. I do not know exactly why. I just did. Be honest with me right now, because I genuinely want to know. If someone called you and told you to step back from the person you had been caring for, the person you had been showing up for, week after week, year after year, and then use that person's fragility as a way to keep you quiet, what would you have done? I ask because I made a choice in that parking lot, and I am still not entirely sure it was the right one. But it is the choice that eventually changed everything. If you know someone who is watching their family do something like this right now, someone who needs to hear that there is a way through, send this to them. Because what comes next is the part that matters. Tone. Cold. Clinical. The narration slows and becomes precise. Rebecca has shifted from hurt to strategic. I hired an attorney in November of 2022. Her name is Patricia Doyle. She practices elder law out of an office on Powder Springs Road in Marietta, and a colleague of mine had used her 2 years earlier when a similar situation, not identical, but similar, had threatened her mother's estate. I sat across from Patricia in a small office that smelled like old paper and carpet cleaner, and I laid out everything I knew. The legal pad. The attorney Linda had sourced. The phone call. The phrase update some papers. The way Dorothy had started repeating things Linda had said to her as though they were her own conclusions. Patricia listened without interrupting. She took notes in a yellow legal pad, which I noticed, and which felt like a small, grim irony. Then, she asked me 2 questions. She asked when Dorothy had first been evaluated for cognitive decline, and she asked whether the evaluating physician had been keeping clinical documentation. I told her about Dr. Anita Voss. I told her Dorothy had been seeing her since February of 2022. I told her I had attended several of those appointments, and that Dr. Voss was meticulous. She ran standardized assessments at every visit. She noted behavioral changes. She tracked the trajectory of Dorothy's cognition over time. Patricia put her pen down. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "That documentation is going to be the most important thing in this case. If it exists the way you are describing it, and if the will amendments were executed during a period Dr. Voss has documented as cognitively compromised, we have an argument for undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity." I asked her what that meant in plain language. She said it meant the changes might not be legally valid. It meant we could potentially have them voided. The next step was finding out exactly what had been changed, and that required obtaining copies of the amendments. Here is something most people do not know. In Georgia, a will is a private document while the person is alive. You cannot simply request a copy. But amendments to financial accounts, changes to beneficiary designations, for example, leave trails, bank records, transfer authorizations, notary stamps. Patricia filed a series of requests. She worked methodically, the way good attorneys work, not dramatically, not with any of the urgency I was feeling in my chest, but steadily, carefully, with the patience of someone who understands that the truth does not need to be rushed. It just needs to be found. It took until January of 2023 before we had the full picture. And the full picture was worse than I had allowed myself to imagine. Tone. Investigative. Precise. Like a prosecutor, laying out evidence. Short sentences. No flourish. There were 4 amendments, 4 separate documents, executed between June 2022 and October 2022, all notarized by the same notary, a woman named Carol Pittman, who worked in the same suite as the attorney Linda had sourced. Amendment 1, June 2022. The beneficiary designation on Dorothy's Regions Bank savings account was changed. My name was removed. Darren and Kayla Mercer were added, split equally. Amendment 2, July 2022. The beneficiary on the credit union account was changed. Same structure. My name out. Bears in. Amendment 3, August 2022. A transfer on death deed was filed on the Marietta property. Previously, the house had been willed to my father and me jointly. The The new deed transferred it entirely to Linda Mercer upon Dorothy's death. Amendment 4, October 2022, Dorothy's original will. The one she had written in 2014 with an attorney she had chosen herself, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had known the Harmon family for 20 years, was superseded by a new will, drafted by Linda's source attorney, that restructured virtually every major asset. In 4 months, between June and October of 2022, my aunt and my 2 cousins had systematically removed me and my father from every document that had once reflected what Dorothy Harmon actually wanted for her family. They had done it quietly, methodically, with a notary on standby and a compliant attorney who had never met my grandmother before that spring, and who would never need to defend the decisions he had helped her make, because by the time anyone questioned those decisions, his job would already be done. That is the part that required cold calculation. That is the part that keeps me up at night even now. Not the greed. Greed I can understand. Greed is human. Greed is ordinary. It is the planning that I cannot fully absorb. The patience of it. The way they had mapped out each step. The way they had worked on Dorothy's perception of me for months before a single document was signed. They had not stolen from her in a moment of weakness. They had engineered the moment of weakness first. And now, I had to prove it. Tone. Methodical. Unglamorous. The audience sees the real work of justice. Boring. Exhausting. Necessary. Nobody tells you what it actually looks like. The work of building a legal case against your own family. It does not look like a courtroom scene. It does not look like a dramatic confrontation where the truth comes out in one devastating speech. It looks like a kitchen table covered in paper. It looks like a phone pressed to your ear for 90 minutes while you wait on hold with a bank's legal department. It looks like driving 40 minutes to a records office to request notarized documents and then driving back to make copies before your attorney needs the originals. It looks like exhaustion, wearing a cardigan, and drinking too much coffee. Patricia and I worked through January and February of 2023, building the foundation. We had 3 categories of evidence to develop. The first was the timeline. We needed to establish exactly when each amendment had been signed, who had been present, and what Dorothy's documented cognitive state was at the time of each signing. This required pulling Dr. Voss's clinical notes from the corresponding dates. The second was the pattern of influence. This meant documenting the frequency and nature of Linda, Darren, and Kayla's contact with Dorothy during the period of the amendments. We subpoenaed phone records. We requested visitor logs from Dorothy's neighborhood watch coordinator, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret who lived 2 houses down and kept an almost compulsive record of who came and went on the street. Margaret, it turned out, had noticed the increased traffic at Dorothy's house. She had noted it because she thought it was nice that Dorothy's family was visiting more. She agreed to provide a written statement without hesitation. The third, and most critical, was the psychiatric documentation. I called Dr. Voss myself. I explained the situation. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in the careful and measured way that physicians speak when they are choosing their words precisely, I have been thorough in my documentation. If my records are subpoenaed, they will reflect what I observed. That was all she said. That was enough. When we finally obtained Dr. Voss's clinical notes through the legal process, what they contained was methodical and devastating. Between February 2022 and October 2022, the exact window during which all 4 amendments had been executed, Dr. Voss had documented a progressive decline in Dorothy's cognitive function. She had administered standardized assessments at each visit. She had noted specific instances of confusion, memory fragmentation, and what she described as increased susceptibility to external suggestion. That phrase, increased susceptibility to external suggestion. In plain language, it meant that Dorothy, during that window, was in a condition where she was more likely to accept what other people told her about herself, her relationships, and her wishes, and less able to distinguish those external impressions from her own authentic judgment. Dr. Voss had documented, in clinical language on dated pages in a secured medical file, exactly the vulnerability that Linda and her children had exploited. She had not done it for us. She had done it because it was her job. Because she was the kind of physician who believed that accurate records were a form of care. But for us, those records were something else entirely. They were the key. Delivery. Calm but charged. The audience is leaning in. This is the moment before the collapse. I have told this story before, in pieces, to people who know me, and every single time, this is the moment where someone stops me and says, "Wait, did it actually work? Did the report actually hold up?" And my answer is always the same. Yes, but not cleanly, and not without cost, and not without my aunt doing something in the final stretch that I genuinely did not see coming. Stories like this happen more often than most people realize. Elderly parents, financial pressure, the slow manipulation of a person whose mind is beginning to soften at the edges. If this is hitting close to something you know, you might want to stay for part 3. Because that is where everything either falls apart or comes together, and I can tell you right now, it goes both ways before it goes one way. By March of 2023, Linda knew something was happening. I do not know exactly how she found out. My best guess is that the bank's legal department notified someone when Patricia filed the records requests. Or perhaps the attorney Linda had used reached out when he realized the documents were being scrutinized. Either way, she knew. And the moment she knew, she stopped being cautious. That was her mistake. The biggest one she made. And she made it because she had been operating without resistance for so long that she had forgotten resistance was possible. She called my father first. She told him I had hired an attorney to challenge their mother's wishes. She told him I was trying to override Dorothy's decisions. She used that word specifically, override, as though my grandmother had made those changes of her own clear and sovereign mind, and I was the one trying to manipulate the outcome. My father called me. His voice had a quality I had not heard from him in years. Something tight and unsteady underneath the surface. He said, "Rebecca, Linda says you are filing something against the family." I said, "Dad, I am filing something to protect Grandma Dorothy from what the family did to her." There was a long silence. And then he said something I will not forget. He said, "I know. I just needed to hear you say it out loud." That was the moment my father chose a side. And it cost him something. It costs you something. To look clearly at your own sister and decide that what she has done is not forgivable. He has never said it in those words. He does not speak in those words. But he knows. And I know he knows. Linda then went to Dorothy. This is the part that still makes something tighten in my chest when I think about it. Because my grandmother was not a prop in this story. She was the whole story. She was the person being fought over and fought for. And she did not have the cognitive clarity to fully understand what was happening around her. Linda went to her and told her that Rebecca was taking her to court. That I was going to force her into a legal battle. That I was going to embarrass her in front of strangers and drag the family through something ugly because I was angry about the will. Dorothy called me on a Tuesday afternoon in early March. I could hear the agitation in her voice before she finished the first sentence. She said, "Rebecca, Linda says you are suing me." I sat down on the floor of my hallway. I do not know why the floor. I just needed to be lower than I was standing. I said, "Grandma, I am not suing you. I would never do anything to hurt you. I am trying to make sure that what you actually wanted is what gets honored." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I do not know what I wanted anymore, Rebecca. I cannot keep all of it straight," and there it was. The most honest thing anyone said in this entire story. She could not keep it straight. Because they had made sure of that. They had filled her head with so many versions of events, so many gentle reframings of her own memory, that she had lost the thread back to her own original mind. I told her I loved her. I told her I was not going anywhere. I told her to rest. Then I called Patricia and told her we needed to move faster. Tone, clinical precision mixed with controlled fury. Short, declarative sentences. The architecture of collapse. Patricia filed in Cobb County Probate Court in April of 2023. The petition challenged all 4 amendments on 2 grounds. First, lack of testamentary capacity. The argument that Dorothy did not have sufficient cognitive function at the time of signing to understand the nature and consequences of the documents she was executing. Second, undue influence. The argument that Linda, Darren, and Kayla had systematically isolated Dorothy, manipulated her perception of her existing relationships, and exploited her diminished cognitive state to direct her decisions in their favor. Both arguments rested on the same foundation, Dr. Anita Voss's clinical record. 94 pages of dated, standardized, methodically organized psychiatric documentation covering 18 consecutive months of Dorothy's cognitive trajectory. Assessment scores, behavioral observations, notes on her reasoning capacity, her short-term recall, her ability to process new information independently, versus her tendency to defer to the most recent person who had spoken to her. 94 pages that mapped, almost perfectly, onto the exact months during which Linda had been bringing her own attorney to my grandmother's kitchen table. Linda's attorney filed a response. He argued that Dorothy had been of sound mind. He submitted a single-page letter from her general practitioner. Not Dr. Voss, not a specialist, not anyone who had conducted formal cognitive assessment, stating that Dorothy was in good general health for her age. Good general health, against 94 pages of specialist documentation. Patricia read me that response letter over the phone. When she finished, there was a pause. Then she said, in the driest voice I have ever heard from a professional, they sent a butter knife to a gunfight. I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed about any of this in months. It came out slightly ragged, like something that had been held in too long. But I want to be careful here. Because a legal filing is not a victory. A legal filing is a beginning. And between April of 2023 and the date the probate judge issued her ruling, there was a period of 4 months that I can only describe as the particular misery of waiting for something important, while the rest of your life continues to require your full attention. I still went to work. I still drove my daughter to volleyball practice on Thursday evenings. I still went to see Dorothy every Sunday. Because I had promised myself I would not let the legal process change how I showed up for her, regardless of what Linda had said, regardless of what anyone thought it looked like. Some of those Sunday visits were hard. Dorothy was sometimes confused about why things felt strained. She could sense something was wrong in the air between the people who loved her, the way older people often can, but she could not always locate the source of it. Some days she was warm and present and entirely herself, sharp and funny and full of the specific small observations that had always been her gift. On those days I would sit across from her at that kitchen table and think, there you are. I can still find you. Other days she was somewhere else, looking at a point just past my shoulder, calling me Susan again. Those days I would drive home on Highway 41 and cry in the car. Not dramatically. Just the quiet kind of crying that happens when you are too tired to hold something in anymore. I cried for her, not for the will, not for the house or the accounts or any of it. For her. Tone, acceleration, short, sharp paragraphs. The antagonist overreaches at exactly the wrong moment. In July of 2023, 3 months into the probate process, Linda did something that Patricia later described as the single most damaging thing she could have done to her own case. She attempted to move Dorothy. Not permanently. Not in a formal, documented way. She called Dorothy and told her that it might be nice to come and stay with her in Alpharetta for a few weeks. A change of scenery, some company. Let Linda take care of her for a while. Dorothy agreed. Of course, she agreed. She was 79 years old, she was lonely in ways I had not fully appreciated, and her daughter was offering her warmth and attention and the uncomplicated comfort of being looked after. I found out on a Sunday morning when I arrived at the house on Marietta Street and found it empty. A note on the kitchen table in Kayla's handwriting said that Dorothy was staying with Linda and would call me when she was settled. I stood in that kitchen for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. The coffee maker had been unplugged. The pill organizer on the counter was still half full from the week before, meaning she had left without her medications properly managed. I photographed the note. I photographed the pill organizer. I called Patricia. Patricia was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "Do not go to Alpharetta. Do not make contact with Linda directly. I am going to make some calls." What Linda had not understood, what her attorney had apparently not explained to her, is that removing a person who is the subject of an active probate dispute from their established residence, without notification to the court or to opposing counsel, is not a small thing. It is the kind of action that makes a judge pay very close attention to your motivations. Patricia filed an emergency motion within 48 hours. She requested that the court issue an order ensuring Dorothy's return to her own home and establishing a formal visitation framework that would apply to all family members equally for the duration of the proceedings. The motion was granted in 6 days. Dorothy came home on a Thursday. I went by that Sunday. She seemed tired and slightly disoriented, the way people get when their routines have been disrupted and they are not entirely sure why. I restocked her pill organizer. I made lunch. We watched the evening news. She held my hand at one point, for no particular reason, the way she sometimes did. I did not say anything about Alpharetta. I did not say anything about Linda. I just held her hand and watched the news anchor talk about something that had nothing to do with any of us. And I thought, Linda just handed us the case. Tone. Controlled triumph. Not explosive. The resolution is real. Which means it is complicated. The probate judge issued her ruling on August 19, 2023. I was sitting in Patricia's office when the document came through. It was a Tuesday morning. Patricia read it on her screen first, and I watched her face, because I had learned by then that her face was more reliable than anything she might say in the first 30 seconds after news arrived. She exhaled. She set her hands flat on the desk. And then she turned her monitor toward me. The judge had found in our favor on both grounds. On the question of testamentary capacity, the ruling cited Dr. Voss's clinical documentation extensively. It noted that the assessment scores recorded during the June through October 2022 window showed a statistically significant decline from Dorothy's baseline, and that the pattern of decline was consistent with impaired capacity to make complex legal and financial decisions without undue external guidance. On the question of undue influence, the ruling noted the pattern of access, the frequency of Linda's contact during the amendment period, the sourcing of a new attorney specifically selected to exclude Dorothy's existing legal counsel, the phone records showing sustained and escalating communication between Linda and Dorothy in the weeks immediately preceding each signing, and found that the totality of the evidence supported a finding of undue influence. All 4 amendments were declared invalid. Dorothy's original 2014 will, drafted with Gerald Fitch when she was entirely clear-headed and entirely her own person, was reinstated as the operative document. I did not celebrate in Patricia's office. I thanked her. She thanked me for being thorough, which I understood was her professional way of acknowledging that the manila folder and the notes app and the Kroger receipt and all of it, all the small, unglamorous, obsessive documentation, had mattered. I drove home. I made dinner. I helped my daughter with homework. And later that night, after she was in bed, I sat at my kitchen table, and I let myself feel it. Not joy. Not exactly. Something closer to grief, with the pressure finally released. Tone. Raw and honest. The messy victory. No clean ending. The moral question lingers. Here is what the ruling did not fix. It did not fix my grandmother's memory. Dorothy is 81 now. She is still in her house on Marietta Street. She still makes her own coffee in the morning. But she is further down a road that only goes one direction, and there are days when the distance between who she is now and who she was 5 years ago feels like something I cannot measure without flinching. The ruling did not fix my father's relationship with his sister. Robert and Linda have not spoken since August of 2023. I do not know if they ever will. I do not know how you come back from what she did. I do not know if the word forgiveness even applies to something this calculated, or whether forgiveness is a luxury that requires the other person to first acknowledge what they chose to do. Linda has never acknowledged it. Not once. Not to me, not to my father, not, as far as I know, to herself. The last thing I know she said, through her attorney, was that she had acted in her mother's best interest, and the court had simply misinterpreted the situation. Misinterpreted. 984 pages of psychiatric documentation. Phone records. A neighbor's written statement. An emergency motion for unauthorized relocation. A probate judge's 12-page ruling. Misinterpreted. Darren's landscaping business closed in early 2024. I do not know the details, and I am honest enough to admit that when I heard, I did not feel nothing. I felt something complicated that I am not proud of, and will not dress up as virtue. Kayla, I heard through a mutual acquaintance, has moved to Chattanooga. I do not know anything beyond that. The ruling did not fix the thing that happened inside my grandmother's mind during those 14 months. The impressions that were planted there, the version of me that Linda had built inside Dorothy's fading memory, some of those impressions did not fully leave. There are still moments when she looks at me with something behind her eyes that was not there before. A faint uncertainty. A fractional hesitation before the warmth comes back. It comes back. It always comes back. But there is a half second now, sometimes, where I have to wait for it, and I will spend the rest of my life not knowing exactly how much of that half second is cognitive decline, and how much of it is what they put there. That is the real cost. Not the legal fees, though those were substantial. Not the months of paperwork and appointments and waiting. Not even the rupture in the family, as permanent as that appears to be. The real cost is that half second. Every Sunday. At that kitchen table. Between when I walk in and when she smiles at me. Tone. Reflective. Unhurried. This is the final philosophical exhale of the story. Do not rush it. I have thought a lot about why Linda did it. I mean, really thought about it. Not the surface version, greed, entitlement, financial pressure. Those are the mechanics. I mean the deeper version. The thing underneath the mechanics. And what I keep coming back to is this. I think Linda convinced herself that she deserved it. I think somewhere in the long private accounting she did of her own life, the years she felt overlooked, the ways she believed the family had not seen her contributions, the slow accumulation of small resentments that most families carry without ever examining, I think she arrived at a place where what she was doing felt less like theft and more like correction. She was not in her own mind stealing from her mother. She was finally taking what she was owed. And that is the most dangerous kind of wrongdoing. The kind that has been rationalized so thoroughly that the person doing it has stopped experiencing it as a choice. They experience it as justice. I cannot give you a clean resolution to that. I cannot tell you that understanding it made me forgive her. Because it did not. I cannot tell you that I am entirely without anger. Because that would not be honest. What I can tell you is what I do with that knowledge. I go to see my grandmother on Sundays. I bring lemon pound cake when it is close to her birthday. I keep the pill organizer filled. I keep a copy of the reinstated will in my filing cabinet and a copy at Patricia's office. I stay close. Because the lesson of all of this, the thing I would tell anyone in a similar situation, is that love without documentation is a vulnerability. Showing up is not enough. You have to show up and pay attention. You have to notice the legal pads on kitchen counters. You have to ask the questions that feel impolite. You have to be willing to be the difficult one. When being difficult is the only thing standing between someone you love and the people who have decided that loving them is a transaction. Dorothy asked me something a few weeks ago. We were sitting in the backyard, in the 2 lawn chairs she has kept on the patio since before I was born. Green plastic, faded to the color of old sage, held together through sheer stubbornness. She was watching a bird at the feeder. She said, without turning to look at me, "Did something happen with Linda?" I looked at the side of her face, the afternoon light on her white hair, the particular stillness she gets when she is asking something she already partially knows the answer to. I said, "Yes, Grandma. Something happened." She was quiet for a moment. The bird flew away. She watched the empty feeder. Then she said, "I am sorry you had to handle it." And I did not know what to do with that. Because that sentence contained more understanding than she had shown in months. It was a window, opening suddenly, into the woman who had always known more than she let on. The woman who had folded her laundry on Tuesday afternoons and known every neighbor by name for 50 years. I said, "You do not have to be sorry, Grandma." She said, "I know, but I am." We sat there until the light changed, until the yard went from gold to gray. We did not say anything else. We did not need to. Delivery. Warm. Direct. Unhurried. The audience is in the emotional afterglow. Meet them there. I want to ask you something before you go, because I have shared this whole story. All of the unglamorous, complicated, painful parts of it, and the one thing I find myself genuinely wondering is what you would have done. Not in the courtroom. Not with the attorney. I mean, in that kitchen, in April of 2022, when I saw the legal pad on the counter, and I turned it face down and went back to making lunch. Would you have picked it up? Would you have taken a photograph? Would you have sat down with your grandmother that afternoon and asked her, directly, what was being discussed in those conversations you were not a part of? Or would you have done exactly what I did? Chosen the comfortable interpretation, the one that let you believe that your family was still the thing you needed it to be. I really want to know. Leave me a comment. Because every single person I have told this story to has a different answer. And I have started to think that the answer says something important about who we are before crisis forces us to find out. If this story meant something to you, if it touched something you have seen, or are living through right now, or are afraid might be coming, share it with someone. Not for me. For them, because sometimes the most useful thing is just knowing that someone else has been in the water and found a way through. Dorothy is 81. She is still in her house, she still makes her own coffee. And every Sunday, I bring the lemon pound cake. That is enough. For now, that is enough.